Your Highness, move!
The shield was supposed to be impenetrable.
Not if someone opened it from inside.
That code belongs to the High Council.
Then the enemy is already inside the palace.
Who would betray the crown?
If you stop now, the royal bloodline dies with you. Earth? That world was erased from every royal map. Not erased.
The ceiling of the throne hall cracks open the way fruit does when you press too hard, all at once and without a warning sound beforehand. One moment I am standing beside my father's dais, half listening to a trade address I have heard in some variation at least a dozen times before, and then the upper floor simply ceases to exist. The sky above Ashen Reach is supposed to be purple at this hour. It is not purple. It is orange and red and wrong. And I have no time to think before Commander Sella's hand closes around my arm and hauls me sideways behind the nearest marble pillar. My ceremonial robes catch on something and tear. I do not stop moving. Around me, my personal guard is shouting codes at each other. Emergency sequences I have sat through in drills since I was old enough to be included in them. And I have heard those codes so many times in controlled conditions that they started to feel like formality. Like the kind of thing you rehearse, not because you expect to need it, but because the rehearsal itself is the point. I am not in a drill. The building is on fire and the codes are real and the alarms and the first explosion arrived in the same breath, which is not supposed to be possible. Sella pulls me low across the floor toward the service entrance at the back of the hall. There is nothing ceremonial in the way she moves. She is not my commander right now. She is simply the person closest to me who has decided I will not die here today. And she is using her body as a wall between me and everything behind us. A column comes down somewhere to our left, one of the tall carved ones that lines the eastern gallery, and the sound it makes hitting the floor is enormous and final. I do not look back. Looking back is something I have already decided I cannot afford. We did not see this coming. I keep thinking that, underneath everything else, like a sentence stuck on repeat. We have 4-star systems under treaty and a shield grid my father described to foreign dignitaries just last month as the strongest in the Outer Rim. Our intelligence networks run across 6 border territories. The idea that an attack could arrive with no warning, no preceding signal, no time to even close the blast doors on the throne wing, sits in my chest like something I cannot swallow. Someone planned this down to the timing. Someone knew exactly how long our response window would be and made certain we would not fit inside it. In the courtyard below, visible through the broken ceiling, I finally get a clear look at the ships responsible. They carry nothing I recognize. No house crest. No faction markings from any of the 6 dominions that share our region of space. No identification at all beyond their movement, which is precise and calm in the way that a very confident enemy tends to be calm. They are cutting through our orbital defense grid like it is a minor inconvenience. My father has referred to that grid in diplomatic contexts as impenetrable. My father is somewhere I cannot currently see, and the not knowing of whether he is alive is a specific kind of fear I have no room for right now. So I fold it up and push it somewhere else and keep moving. Move, Sella says, and I move. The service corridor behind the throne wing smells of smoke and hot stone and something underneath that I cannot name. Something chemical and sharp. My torn robes catch twice more on fallen debris and twice more I do not stop. My mind, doing the strange thing that minds apparently do when the body is in genuine danger, goes somewhere else entirely. It goes to a planet I have not allowed myself to think about in years. Small, quieter than anything in our systems, with a sky that turns a particular soft pink in the evenings and too much green everywhere you look. Earth. I was sent there when I was young. The first credible attempt on our bloodline happened when I was 8 years old. And my father's advisors determined that the safest place to hide an heir was somewhere nobody would think to look. Somewhere so unimportant to the larger political map that no enemy would bother monitoring it. They gave me a simple name and a simple story and found me a household with a woman named Grace, who asked no questions about why my eyes shifted color in direct sunlight. I remember grass under bare feet on summer mornings. I remember the smell of bread baking and the sound of Grace humming to herself while she worked. I remember a boy with perpetually scraped hands who had a habit of positioning himself between me and trouble without ever making a production of it, even when the trouble was twice his size. He never asked if I was worth defending. He simply decided that I was and acted accordingly. I do not have his name anymore. The royal physicians took it from me carefully when I returned to my duties, along with most of the other things from that time. They called it smoothing the transition. They were probably right. Practically speaking, I have resented it quietly ever since. Another explosion goes off close enough that the heat of it presses against my face, and I come back into the corridor, into the smoke and the shouting and the sound of my home being destroyed. "Commander, where are we going?" I say. My voice comes out smaller than I intend. "Docking Bay 9. Sela says. "If it still stands." It does not still stand. When we round the final corner and the bay opens in front of us, what we find is a ruin. Transport ships burning where they sat. The bay structure itself buckled from a hit that must have landed early, targeting the infrastructure before we even knew the attack had begun. Sela stops so suddenly that I walk into her back. She stands very still for a moment, and I watch something move across her face that I have never seen there before. Not quite fear. Something close enough to it that seeing it on her frightens me more than anything the enemy has done yet. "They knew exactly where to hit," she says, mostly to herself. "Then the enemy finds us. They come down the corridor behind us, dark armor with no house marking, moving with the unhurried confidence of soldiers who believe the outcome is already settled. The only symbol on them is a broken circle in pale gray, and I do not recognize it from anything in my years of political study. Sela pushes me behind her and raises her weapon, and I understand with absolute clarity what she is doing. She is going to use whatever time she has left to buy me some of hers. I want to tell her not to. The words do not reach the surface before the corridor lights up with return fire that does not come from our people. The sound is different, sharper, a faster rhythm than anything produced by standard Dominion armories, rougher at the edges, like a weapon designed by people who cared more about effective than elegant. I go down behind a fallen support beam with my hands pressed over my head, which helps with nothing and feels necessary anyway. Shapes are dropping through the open ceiling of the ruined bay. They wear armor in a matte green that does not belong to any house I know, and they do not move like any soldiers I have ever watched in exercises or in the archival footage from old campaigns. They move wrong. That is the only language I have for it. Wrong, like they were never taught the rules of engagement that both my people and the enemy seem to be following. One of them slides across the debris field on his knees and comes up firing before I have fully processed that he fell. Another closes distance when a trained combatant would have pulled back, using the angle of the wreckage around him as though it was placed there deliberately for his benefit. It is strange to watch. It is also clearly working. Sela pulls me lower by the collar and raises her comm. "Unknown forces," she says, voice tight and controlled, requesting identification. The answer comes in our trade language with an accent I have never heard before. "Clipped and efficient. Earth Expeditionary Force. We are responding under treaty provisions. Get your princess to the lower tunnels. We will hold this position, Earth." The word lands differently than it should. I have not heard anyone else say it aloud in over a decade. Not outside my own head in private moments I generally refuse to acknowledge. Hearing it now, here, in the middle of smoke and fire in my burning home, does something to the inside of my chest that I do not have time to examine. It feels like reaching for something that has been just out of reach for a long time and finding it closer than expected. Sela does not give me the chance to sit with it. She is already moving toward the tunnel entrance, and my legs follow before my thoughts catch up. Near the tunnel door, one of the green-armored soldiers is holding the position alone, 3 opponents against 1, and by every combat principle I was ever taught, those numbers should not end in his favor. They are not ending in his favor. The way he moves keeps snagging on something in my memory. The particular angle of his head before each strike, the stubborn set of his stance even when retreating would be the sensible choice. Something about it feels familiar in a way I cannot locate. Then Sela pulls me through the door and it grinds shut behind us, and the sound of the fight disappears as if it never happened. The tunnel is cool and dark and smells of old stone. For a while, there is nothing but the sound of my own breathing and Sela's footsteps on stone and the muffled, distant sounds of a battle still happening somewhere above us. A young guard named Petra follows close behind, relaying reports through her comm. Human forces pushing back from the north approach. Enemy retreating toward the ridge. The docking bay is a total loss. Who are they? I ask. I mean the green-armored soldiers, not the enemy. Earth barely maintains an embassy at the outer rim relay point. They have no military presence anywhere near our systems. Sela's jaw is set. I do not know, Your Highness, but they just saved your life. And right now that is the only fact about them that matters. She is right. I do not argue. The tunnels widen eventually into a lower emergency chamber. Storage crates along the walls with dust thick on every surface. A bench bolted to the stone floor that looks like it has not been used since the chamber was first built. Sela pushes me toward it and allows herself one long, Careful breath. The first sign she has permitted herself of the exhaustion she must be carrying. We wait here, she says, until the surface is cleared. I nod, my hands will not stop shaking. Small, persistent tremors in my fingers that I cannot talk myself out of no matter how tightly I press my palms together. I keep hearing the throne hall ceiling split open. I keep seeing the smoke in the orange sky. I keep thinking about the guards who were shouting codes at each other when I last looked back, and trying not to think about the column that came down on the eastern side. I press my hands over my eyes and think instead about an old kitchen and a woman who hummed while she worked, and a boy who always had scrapes on his knuckles and who laughed half a second later than everyone else, like he needed to decide first whether the thing was actually funny. I still do not have his name, but sitting here in the dark with my home burning above me, some part of my memory that has spent years behaving itself simply stops cooperating. I remember the fence at the back of the school property that was always half broken and nobody fixed it. I remember stolen apples in a specific afternoon in late summer when we sat under the old tree and he told me a story he had made up entirely, claiming it was something he had read, and I knew he was lying and did not say so because the story was a good one. I do not know why my mind goes there now, of all the possible moments. Maybe fear strips away the conditioning the physicians put in. Maybe some things are just too heavy to stay buried indefinitely. The platform at the end of the tunnel holds a shuttle with its engines already running. It is the ugliest ship I have ever seen up close, boxy and dented and wearing old burn marks along one flank that suggest this is not its first extraction. But the engines sound solid and the hatch is open, and I have never in my life been so grateful for an ugly thing. A woman in green armor stands at the hatch and waves us forward with short, efficient gestures. She pulls her helmet off as we approach. Her face is lined with old scars, and her eyes have the particular quality of someone who has seen considerably more than they wanted to and kept going anyway. Princess Vaughn, she says, Captain North Fields, Earth Expeditionary Force. We need to move right now. Sella slows. How did you know we needed extraction? She says. How did you know which defenses to hit first? Fields pauses. Something moves across her expression. A flicker of something I cannot name. A longer answer than we have time for right now. She says, come aboard and I will tell you what I can once we are clear. I do not argue. My ears are still ringing and my legs are exhausted and I want to be somewhere the ceiling is intact. I climb into the shuttle, Sella behind me, and the hatch seals with a sound that makes something in my chest loosen just slightly. The first loosening in hours. Inside it is cramped and warm and smells of metal and hard use. Soldiers in green armor are running quiet checks on weapons, speaking to each other in short-clipped sentences. Nobody bows when I enter. Nobody adjusts their posture or avoids my eyes. They make room and go back to their work. And the normalcy of it, the complete absence of the careful performance I have lived inside for my entire life, catches me off guard in a way I was not prepared for. We lift and bank hard and join a formation of similar ships rising away from the surface. Through the small viewport, I watch Ashen Reach burn beneath us. I make myself look at it. Looking away feels like something I would not be able to forgive myself for later. Fields drops into the seat across from me once we are clear of the defense line. Your father is alive, she says, leading with the one thing that matters most, minor injuries. He is aboard our cruiser. I look down at my hands because otherwise I am going to embarrass myself in front of people I just met. Thank you, I manage after a moment. I do not understand why Earth would take this kind of risk for us, but I am genuinely grateful. Something flickers across her expression again, that same difficult-to-name discomfort. She nods once and goes back to her soldiers, and I am left with more questions than I had before she sat down. The flight takes close to an hour. I spend most of it watching stars drift past where explosions used to be and feeling the particular empty quiet that settles in after fear has exhausted itself. Sella sits beside me. We do not speak much. It is enough to simply exist in the same space without anything actively trying to kill us. The cruiser is an enormous thing, humming with the low constant energy of a serious military vessel. I am walked through corridors full of green-armored soldiers who nod as I pass with the professional, unhurried respect of people who have jobs to do. No kneeling, no lowered eyes, no one adjusting their breathing when I walk into the room. It is disorienting in a way I cannot explain. And underneath the disorientation, something that might be relief. The medical bay is small and very bright. My father sits on the edge of a cot, with a bandage on his arm,
and a pallor to his face I have never seen before.
He is alive. When he sees me come through the door, the composure he has maintained through every crisis I have ever watched him navigate simply gives way. and he reaches for me without waiting for me to bow. Without the formal acknowledgement that has preceded every physical contact between us my entire life. "I thought I had lost you," he says, and his voice has a roughness in it I do not recognize. "I thought the same," I say. For a while we simply hold each other, and I let myself feel the relief of it without trying to manage it. A commander finds us eventually. Alan Whitfield, Earth Expeditionary Force. He carries more rank insignia than Captain Fields does, and he moves with the deliberate economy of someone who learned long ago not to waste motion. He explains, in short, careful sentences, what I had already half suspected. The intervention was not accidental and not simply a treaty obligation being honored at the last possible moment. Intelligence was intercepted weeks ago, suggesting a coordinated and deliberate plan to eliminate our bloodline entirely. Something far beyond a routine border dispute or political provocation. The Earth command structure moved fast, faster than standard protocols would normally allow, because someone within that structure had pushed the mission through with an urgency that exceeded his authorization. Someone specific requested to lead the extraction personally, Whitfield says, choosing each word with visible care. Without his persistence, we would not have arrived in time. My father frowns. "One soldier," he says. "Why would one soldier prioritize the survival of a dominion he has no formal connection to?" Whitfield's eyes shift toward the doorway, where someone is standing just outside it. Someone I had not noticed until that moment. "I think it would be better," Whitfield says, if he explained that in his own words. The figure in the doorway steps forward, green armor, helmet off, tucked under one arm. He is taller than I expected. Or maybe it is just the way the room shifts when he enters it. The years have changed his face in the ways that years do. Carved lines around his eyes and jaw. Taken some softness and replaced it with something steadier. But something in the angle of his jaw. Something in the way he meets my eyes and holds them a half-second longer than a stranger would. Pulls at something I did not know I still had. "Sergeant Ethan Grant," Whitfield says. "He led the strike team that reached you in the palace." I look at him carefully. "Thank you," I say. "You fought like you had something personal at stake in the outcome." He does not look away from me. "I did," he says. The room goes quiet in the way it does when people recognize they are in the middle of something that does not belong to them. My father asks, slowly and carefully, whether the sergeant would like to explain his interest in the welfare of a princess he has never met. Ethan hesitates. His eyes move to Whitfield briefly, who gives the smallest possible nod. Then he looks back at me, and there is something in his expression that should not be on the face of a military officer. Something old and unguarded, like a door that has been shut for a very long time being opened carefully. "Do you remember?" He starts and stops. He tries again. "Your Highness, do you remember a small town? A field behind a school? A fence along the back of the property that was always half broken and nobody ever came to fix?" The words go through me like cold water. The medical bay does not disappear, but it goes distant. My father's face, Whitfield's careful expression, Sella's uncertain shift behind me, all of it recedes. And what fills the space instead is the image of an old fence, a particular afternoon in summer, and the sound of someone laughing half a second late. "How could you possibly know that?" I say. My voice does not sound like my own. He takes a step closer. There is a scar along his jaw, thin and pale, and it matches something I did not know I was still carrying. A small boy falling from a fence and finding it funnier than painful. "Because I was there," he says. "We used to get apples from the tree on the other side of that fence. You called yourself Kaya. You told everyone your family traveled for work. I never believed it, but I never said so either." My hand moves to my mouth without my permission. "That is not possible," I say. "That part of my life was taken from me. I was told never to speak of it again." "I know," he says. There is something old and careful in his voice. Something that has been carried quietly for a long time. "I was 11 years old, and I watched a ship take you out of that field one night, and nobody would ever explain to me what happened or where you went. The room is very quiet. You joined the military because of me," I say, understanding coming in pieces. "I joined because I refused to accept you were just gone," he says. "Every assignment, every intelligence file, every intercepted signal that crossed anything close to my desk. When the report came through about a coordinated strike against the Vaughn bloodline, I found an old name buried in the decrypted data, a name nobody else in that room would have recognized, and I did not care what it cost me to get this mission approved. He would have done significantly more than that," Whitfield says, from somewhere behind me. Ethan does not confirm it or deny it. He does not need to. 15 years of careful, deliberate forgetting are coming apart in the space of a single conversation. Standing in front of me is the proof that somewhere out among all of this, a boy who once refused to let anyone push me around without a second thought grew into someone who spent 15 years refusing to stop looking, even when every reasonable person around him must have told him to let it go. Kaya, I say softly. It is the first time I have said that name aloud since I was a child, and something in his face opens at the sound of it, just slightly, just enough. I never stopped hoping, he says, not once. Behind us, my father clears his throat gently, and I become aware that the entire room has gone very still. Soldiers and officials alike watching with the quiet of people who understand they are in the middle of something they are not part of. But even as relief and disbelief and 15 years of sealed-off grief are doing something complicated inside my chest, I can feel something colder settling underneath all of it. The attack on Ashen Reach was not random. Someone planned it down to the timing, hit exactly the right points in exactly the right order, and they will not stop because one strike failed. Whatever this is, whatever impossible thread has pulled Ethan Grant back across 15 years and an entire galaxy of distance. There is no pause in the world right now to simply sit with the wonder of it. The war that found me in my own throne room this morning has not finished with me yet. Sleep should have come easily. I was exhausted in the kind of way that goes past the body and into something deeper. The kind that comes from running on adrenaline for hours and then having it drop out from under you all at once. But the narrow bunk in the cabin they gave me was unfamiliar. The sounds of the cruiser were different from anything I had grown up with. And every time I closed my eyes, I heard the throne hall ceiling coming apart. I lay still for a long time, staring at the overhead and listening to the ship breathe around me. The cruiser had its own rhythm, low and constant, not unpleasant. After a while, I gave up on sleep entirely and sat on the edge of the bunk, looking at my own hands in the dim light. They had finally stopped shaking, which felt like a small victory. The skin on my palms was red from how hard I had pressed them together during the long tunnel wait, and there was a bruise forming on my forearm where something had caught me during the run from the bay. I had not noticed it until now. There was a small mirror bolted to the wall across from the bunk. I looked at my own face for a while without entirely recognizing myself. Tired, pale, with a scratch along my jaw I had no memory of acquiring. My eyes were their default color in the dim light, gray-green. The color they settled into when nothing was pushing them to shift. On Earth they had shifted constantly. A problem I managed by staying out of direct sunlight when I could and hoping nobody looked too closely when I could not. Kaya, they had called me. A girl who traveled a lot for work and had unusual eyes and never talked about her family in any detail. 15 years ago. It felt longer. It also, somehow, felt like something that had happened to someone else. A knock at the cabin door interrupted my thoughts. Quiet enough that it might have been meant not to disturb me if I was sleeping. I opened the door. Ethan was standing in the corridor in his off-duty uniform, gray and simple, without any of the armor. He looked younger without the plating and the helmet. He also looked tired in a way that suggested his night was going about as well as mine. I wanted to make sure you were settling in, he said. It has been a long day for everyone, but yours was something else. Come in, I said, stepping aside. He hesitated briefly before entering, the way people do in unfamiliar spaces, and looked around the small cabin with the careful attention of someone taking in their surroundings. Without the armor and the context of the medical bay and Whitfield's formal introduction, he seemed more uncertain, or maybe more real. Less like a soldier and more like a person who did not quite know what to do with his hands. I keep expecting to wake up, I admitted, sitting back on the edge of the bunk. This entire day feels like something my mind assembled out of stress and shock. He leaned against the wall near the door. I understand that better than you might think, he said. For years I had an idea in my head of what finding you again would look like. I built probably 100 different versions of how it might happen. None of them looked anything like today. What did the other versions look like? He almost smiled, though there was something sad at the edges of it. Simpler, quieter. I used to imagine just walking past you somewhere ordinary. A market, a transit station somewhere with no explosions involved. I am sorry reality did not cooperate with your imagination. He laughed, brief and genuine, and the sound of it eased something tight in my chest. I am not, he said, more seriously. Whatever shape it took, I found you. That is more than I let myself hope for. Most days. We sat in comfortable quiet for a while after that. Two people who once knew other, completely now carefully taking stock of who the other had become. It was strange and not unpleasant. Like being handed back something you had written off as permanently lost. Eventually, the exhaustion pulling at him became obvious, and he excused himself and promised to find me in the morning, and left me alone with thoughts too tangled to sort out before sleep finally arrived. It did not arrive quickly. I woke up an hour later from a dream I could not remember, and lay in the dark knowing sleep was not coming back for a while. Eventually, I gave up again and pulled on the simple gray uniform they had provided and stepped out into the corridor. Ethan was already there. He was leaning against the wall a few meters from my door, still in his off-duty clothes but clearly not having slept either, his helmet resting on a crate beside him. He looked up when I came out, not quite surprised, as though he had been half expecting this. "You should be resting," he said. "So should you," I said. "Fair enough." We looked at each other in the dim corridor lighting, and neither of us suggested going back to our respective rooms. "Walk with me," I said. He pushed off the wall and fell into step beside me without asking where we were going, as naturally as if we had done this 1,000 times, which we had, in a different life. We used to walk everywhere, partly because there was always somewhere to go, and partly because walking was easier than sitting still when you had too much energy and not enough to do with it. I had forgotten that. Standing in the corridor in the middle of the night on a military cruiser I had never been on before. I remembered it. We ended up in a small observation deck near the rear of the ship, mostly empty at this hour. A wide viewport looked out over open space, clean and dark and impossibly still given everything happening around us. I sat on a low bench near the glass, and after a moment he settled beside me, close enough that I was aware of him without it being uncomfortable. Outside, the stars drifted past at the slow, patient pace they always maintained regardless of what was happening in the spaces between them. "Tell me everything," I said. "Not the version you gave my father in Whitfield. The real one." He was quiet for a while, looking out at the stars. "After they took you," he said finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of the formal edges he had used in the medical bay. I did not understand what had happened. Nobody explained it. Grace tried. "She told me your family had needed to go somewhere safer, that it was complicated and that I should not worry. I was 11 and safer meant nothing to me. All I understood was that you were there and then you were not. And the ship that took you was not any kind of ship I had ever seen. And no one would tell me anything at all. I watched the stars move. I did not choose to leave," I said. "I did not even understand what was happening until we were already in the air. They told me Earth was a temporary arrangement, that I should forget it as quickly as I could because carrying it would make my return harder. They were probably right, practically speaking. For a long time," he said, "I thought maybe you had simply moved on, that wherever you ended up, you had a full life and people you cared about, and no particular reason to think about a kid from a broken fence in a town you had only lived in for 2 years. That seemed possible. It seemed like something I should just accept." He paused. "It took me years to find out the truth. That your people suppress certain memories on purpose when a royal returns from a posting. That you were not allowed to remember even if you wanted to. How did you find that out?" "I enlisted as soon as I was old enough," he said, "partly because I did not know what else to do with the anger, and partly because military service gives you access to information that ordinary people never see. Intelligence reports, old diplomatic files, records of hidden postings. I chased every thread I could find for years. Most of them went nowhere. But I kept going because stopping felt like confirming that you were just gone, and I was not willing to confirm that." I watched his profile in the low light of the observation deck, the tiredness around his eyes, the set of his jaw, which was exactly the same stubborn set it had always been, just belonging to an older face now. "You gave up a great deal," I said. "An entire life spent chasing a memory that could have led nowhere." "It led somewhere," he said, turning to look at me directly. "It led here." Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence between us was full rather than empty. The way silences get between people who have something real to say and are deciding how to say it. "There is something else," he said eventually. His voice went quieter and more careful. "The reason I pushed this mission through was not only hope. About 2 months ago, one of our intelligence posts intercepted a fragment of communication between 2 unidentified parties. They were discussing something they've referred to as the Vaughn problem. They spoke about eliminating a bloodline entirely, not simply weakening a rival or taking territory. The phrasing was deliberate, thorough. This was not opportunistic aggression. A cold weight settled into my stomach. "You knew before the attack that someone was planning this." I knew something was being planned. I did not know how soon or how large. When the report came through and I saw the Vaughn name, I started pulling every file I could find on your family's political history, your defense arrangements, anything that might tell me what the target was. That was when I found the secondary phrase, the one that kept appearing in fragmentary intercepts over the past 18 months. He met my eyes. The air must not reach the archive. The words sat between us for a moment. The archive, I repeated. I do not know what that means. Neither did we. Entirely. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. But whatever it is, someone has been willing to commit a full coordinated military strike against an entire royal bloodline to prevent you from accessing it. That tells me it is not a minor thing. I thought about my father's face in the medical bay, the tiredness in it that went beyond injury and shock. I thought about the way Whitfield had described someone within our court potentially feeding information to the enemy. The inside information that would have been necessary to time the attack so precisely, to know which defenses to disable first. You think someone in my own dominion helped them, I said. I think it is possible. More than possible. The timing of the attack required knowledge of your father's schedule and your own position in the palace. That kind of operational detail does not come from long-range surveillance. Someone gave it to them. I pressed my palms against my eyes and held them there for a moment, trying to steady the dizziness threatening to come back. In the space of a single day, I had lost my home. Discovered that someone within my own court may have been working against my family for years, and found out that my bloodline carried a responsibility I had never been told about. And sitting beside me in the dark was the proof that a boy who once refused to let anyone push me around without thought had spent 15 years refusing to stop looking for me, even when every reasonable person must have told him there was nothing to find. Why would anyone want my bloodline erased? I said. We are not the most powerful house in the region. We are not the wealthiest. What could we possibly threaten? He was quiet for a moment. Whatever the archive is, he said, your family is the only one with access to it. That makes you the obstacle between someone and something they want badly enough to plan an operation like this for years, before either of us could continue. The deck lighting shifted without warning to a harsh red, and a klaxon began somewhere deep in the ship's structure. The change in the room was immediate. Ethan's posture went from tired and open to focused and alert in the same instant. 15 years of training cutting straight through exhaustion. Stay close, he said, already moving toward the door. His expression completely different from the one he had been wearing a moment before. We came out into a corridor full of people moving fast and with purpose. Captain Fields intercepted us almost immediately, her face tight. Sensors picked up an unidentified vessel approaching on an intercept course, she said. It matches the signature profile from the attack on Ashen Reach. They followed us, I said. The cold weight in my stomach dropped further. Or they were tracking you the entire time, Ethan said, which would mean the source inside your dominion is still active. Commander Whitfield arrived moments later, already issuing orders through his comm. Voice steady despite the tension filling the corridor. All hands to battle stations. He looked at us both. Princess Vaughn, Sergeant Grant, with me. We need to determine what we are dealing with before this escalates. On the command deck, the main view screen showed the approaching vessel, dark and unmarked, moving with the same deliberate precision the enemy forces at Ashen Reach had displayed. A young officer reported that sensor analysis suggested it was a scout configuration, likely here to confirm whether I had survived the initial attack before calling in a larger strike force. Whitfield said it quietly, but the meaning of it was not quiet. If that ship reported back with confirmation that I was alive, the next assault would come faster and harder, and with the benefit of knowing what had gone wrong the first time. We cannot let it transmit, Ethan said. Whitfield nodded slowly. He was already thinking through options. His expression, the particular kind of focused calm that comes from having been in situations like this before and gotten through them. Recommendations. Let me take a strike team and board it directly, Ethan said immediately. We disable the long-range communications array before it can send anything back. We get whatever intelligence it carries while we are inside. That is a high-risk approach. Sergeant, everything about today has been high risk, sir. Whitfield did not argue with that because there was nothing to argue with. I stepped forward before I had entirely decided to. I want to go with the strike team. The command deck went quiet in a very specific way. Every officer present turned to look at me, and the silence had the quality of people working out how to respond to something unreasonable. Your Highness, Whitfield began. This war exists because of my bloodline, I said. My home is gone and my people are scattered, and someone in my own court sold information to the enemy for reasons I do not understand yet. I am not willing to sit in a locked room waiting for other people to fight a battle that started with me. Whitfield looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Sela, who had arrived at some point without my noticing and was standing near the door. She has had defensive combat training since childhood, Sela said quietly. I have overseen it personally. She is not without capability. Whitfield studied me. The calculation happening behind his expression was not difficult to read. He was weighing the political risk of allowing a foreign princess into an active combat operation against the political cost of refusing her in a way that might damage the alliance forming between our peoples. Fine, he said finally. You follow Sergeant Grant's instructions without deviation. That is a condition, not a suggestion. If he tells you to move, you move. If he tells you to stay, you stay. Is that clear? Completely clear, I said. Ethan moved beside me, lowering his voice so the rest of the command deck could not hear. Kaya, are you certain about this? I spent my entire childhood being told to hide, I said, being told to run and let other people handle the danger. I am done running from a fight that has already found me twice today. Something moved across his face. Worry and something else underneath it. Something warmer. Then stay close, he said, and trust my judgment the way you used to trust mine on that broken fence. I never stopped, I said, and I meant it more completely than I had meant most things I had said in recent memory. The strike team assembled quickly in the lower bay, 7 soldiers including Ethan, checking equipment with the brisk, practiced efficiency of people who did this regularly. I was handed a compact sidearm and given a rapid, urgent lesson in its use by a broad-shouldered soldier with a scar through his left eyebrow who introduced himself as Corporal Oliver Hart. Keep your elbow in slightly, Hart said. You want the grip stable, not locked. If you are close enough to need it, you are close enough that technique matters. Has he done this before? I asked Ethan quietly. Teaching people to shoot in the 10 minutes before a boarding operation. Mostly new recruits, Ethan said. Never a princess. Then I suppose I'm his most unusual student. Without question, he said. And something passed between us that had no business being there given the circumstances, but was there anyway. A small warm thing carved out of the middle of the tension. The shuttle bay doors opened onto open space and the distant dark shape of the enemy vessel, waiting. I sat in my seat and kept my breathing steady the way Sela had taught me years ago in drills I had resented at the time and was now deeply grateful for. Outside the viewport, the target grew steadily larger as we closed the distance. And I thought about an old broken fence and stolen apples and a boy who never once asked whether I was worth the trouble. 2 minutes to contact, the pilot said. Ethan crouched beside me. His voice coming through the comm unit clipped to my ear. Once we are aboard, stay directly behind Hart, unless I tell you otherwise. He has the widest cover profile on the team. If I say move, you move without asking why. If I say down, you go down immediately. Do you understand? I understand, I said. Good. He held my eyes for a moment. I have spent 15 years keeping you somewhere in mind. I am not losing you in the next hour. He stood up before I could answer, and the shuttle hit the hull of the enemy vessel with a heavy metallic clang that went through the floor and up through my legs. And there was no more time for conversation. The hatch blew inward with a controlled charge that was louder than I expected in the confined space of the shuttle. And the strike team moved through the opening in a smooth, coordinated flow before the sound had fully finished. I counted to 3 the way Ethan had told me to and then followed Hart through. Stepping into the interior of the enemy vessel with my sidearm raised the way I had been shown and my pulse doing something my training had never quite prepared me for. The interior was dim and utilitarian in a way that felt deliberate rather than neglected. No decorative elements. No indication that anyone had ever considered the experience of moving through these corridors as anything other than a purely functional act. Exposed conduit lines ran along the ceiling. The lighting was emergency level, harsh and directionless. It smelled of recycled air and something faintly chemical underneath. The same chemical smell I had noticed during the attack on Ashen Reach, and recognizing it here made something in my stomach tighten. Clear, Ethan said after a moment, and the team spread into the space with practiced precision, each of them taking angles without being told, covering the approaches without conversation because they had done this enough times that conversation was not necessary. I stayed exactly where I had been told to stay, 1 step behind Hart's left shoulder, and I did not look at anything except what I was supposed to be looking at, which was the corridor ahead and the corners where it turned. Hart moved with a solidity that was reassuring in a specific way. Not calm exactly, but grounded. as though whatever came around the next corner was something he had already decided he could handle. Communications array is 2 decks up, Ethan said, checking the small display on his forearm. We move fast and we do not stop for anything that is not directly in our path. Understood. The team moved. The first contact came sooner than I think anyone had planned for. 2 enemy soldiers rounding a junction ahead, and the response from Ethan's team was so fast I barely tracked it. 2 quick controlled bursts, and both figures were down before I had fully registered the threat. I flinched at the sound. Then I kept moving. Because flinching and stopping were 2 different things, and I had been told to keep moving. You are doing fine, Ethan said, falling back beside me for a moment as we passed the junction. I am terrified, I said. That is completely reasonable. He did not slow his pace. Terrified and doing fine are not the same thing, but they are also not opposites. Keep going. It helped more than it should have. Hearing it said plainly like that without reassurance layered on top of it, I kept going. The resistance built steadily as we pushed deeper into the vessel, which meant we were going the right direction. Enemy soldiers emerging from side corridors in increasing numbers, clearly alerted to our presence and converging on the position we were heading toward. Ethan's team handled each contact with the same unfussy efficiency, and I focused on staying exactly where I was supposed to be and not becoming an additional problem for anyone to manage. Hart took a glancing hit to his shoulder, plating at one of the junctions, and simply grunted and kept moving. When I looked at him to check, he said, "Armor took most of it," and then went back to watching his angles. I found this both reassuring and slightly unnerving. They know exactly where we are going, Ethan said, as we cleared the last stairwell before the communications deck, which means they are going to try to transmit before we reach them. We need to move faster. We rounded the final corner and found ourselves facing a sealed door that was considerably more reinforced than anything else in the vessel. The kind of reinforcement that signals you have arrived at, the thing someone most wants to protect. Ethan moved to plant a charge on the locking mechanism. Before he could finish, the door slid open from the inside and 3 enemy soldiers came through it already firing. The corridor became very loud very fast. I went down behind a support strut with my back against the wall and my sidearm raised. The way I had been positioned by a combination of Hart's hand on my shoulder and pure instinct. And the exchange above me lasted perhaps 20 seconds but felt considerably longer. When it ended, 2 of the 3 were down. The 3rd had retreated back through the doorway and sealed it from the inside. He is going to transmit, Ethan said. The urgency in his voice was controlled but completely clear. We need through that door immediately. Hart was already working on the mechanism, but the reinforced door was resisting in a way that ordinary doors had not, and the seconds passing were not comfortable ones. I watched Ethan's jaw tighten. Every second we spent standing in that corridor was a second the enemy soldier on the other side spent trying to compose a message that would confirm my survival and bring something worse down on all of us. An idea arrived, the way ideas sometimes do under pressure, fully formed and arriving without a preamble. "Wait," I said, and stood up. "Let me try something." Ethan looked at me. Dominion communication systems retain royal access override protocols as a failsafe, I said. Emergency measures. Built into the base architecture in case a system needs to be shut down without standard authorization. If this vessel was built using copied Dominion technology, the underlying structure may still carry those protocols, even if whoever built the ship did not know to remove them. You can access it remotely. I do not know yet, but I can try. And trying takes less time than waiting for Hart to cut through that door. Ethan looked at Hart, who was making incremental progress on the mechanism. Then he looked back at me. Something moved across his face that might have been the particular feeling of being in a situation where the available options are all imperfect, and you have to choose the least imperfect one quickly. "Get her close enough," he told Hart. Hart shifted his position, putting his body between me and the door, and I moved up beside him and placed my hand against the wall panel adjacent to the sealed entrance. The panel was dark, standard inactive state. I felt along the edge of it for the secondary interface that Dominion architecture always carried beneath the primary surface, the one that was there for exactly this kind of emergency, and found it after a moment. A slight raised ridge in the material that most people who were not looking for it would have walked past 1,000 times. I pressed it and held. Nothing happened for 3 seconds, which felt like considerably more. Then the panel flickered, shifted, and a secondary interface appeared beneath the standard display. and I recognized the structure of it immediately because I had been trained on it since I was 12 years old. Someone had built this vessel using copied Dominion technology and had either not known about the Royal Access layer embedded in the base code or had not known how to remove it. Either way, it was there. I entered the override sequence from memory. My hands were not entirely steady, but steady enough. The sealed door clicked and slid open. Ethan's team moved through in under 2 seconds. The lone enemy soldier inside was managed before he could finish the transmission he had been composing. The send command still highlighted on the console in front of him, not yet executed. Hart pulled him back, and Ethan looked at me across the small communications room with an expression that was somewhere between relief and something more complicated. I moved to the central console. The data on it was far more than I expected. Not just the incomplete transmission, not just communication logs from the past several days. The console was connected to a much larger cache, and as I began pulling through it, reading the structure of what was stored here, the scope of what I was looking at started to become clear in a way that made the room feel smaller. "Ethan," I said, "you need to see this." He was beside me in a few steps, scanning the display with the focused attention of someone who knew how to read intelligence data quickly. "Coordinates," I said, "dozens of them, cross-reference with personnel files. These are not attack coordinates. These are locations. And these are names." He leaned closer. His expression went from focused to dark. "These are names from inside your father's court," he said, "not just names. Access designations. Which advisors have clearance to which restricted locations? Who knows what? And when they acquired that knowledge." I kept scrolling through the cache, and the picture assembling itself was not a comfortable one. This is not simply an attack plan. Whoever built this file was mapping the interior of our court from the inside out. They have been doing it for a long time. "They are not trying to eliminate your bloodline and then find the archive," Ethan said, very quietly. "They already know where it is. They are trying to eliminate everyone who could prevent them from reaching it, which means the betrayal goes deeper than one person," I said. He nodded, and did not try to soften it. "Someone close to my family, close enough to have this level of detail about internal access designations, had been feeding information outward for long enough to build a file this comprehensive." The attack on Ashenreach had not been the beginning. It had been the culmination of something that had been building quietly for years, possibly longer than I had been alive. Before either of us could say anything further, the alarm began. "Multiple vessels inbound," Hart said, his voice coming through the comm from the corridor, "converging on our position. We have stayed too long." "Copy that," Ethan said immediately, and the softness in his voice from a moment before was entirely gone, replaced by the clean, focused edge that I had come to associate with him when situations required it. "Grab everything the drive will hold. We move in 60 seconds. I worked fast, pulling as much of the cache as the portable drive Ethan had handed me could carry, compressing where I could, prioritizing the personnel files and the coordinate data because those felt like the most immediately actionable pieces of what we had found. My hands were shaking again, but they were doing what I asked them to do, which was enough. 60 seconds, Ethan said, and I pulled the drive and followed him out of the communications room at a pace that left no room for hesitation. The return trip through the vessel was faster and considerably louder than the approach had been. Enemy reinforcements were moving through the corridors toward us from multiple directions, and Ethan's team handled each contact with the same efficiency as before, but with an added urgency now, pushing forward rather than clearing and holding. I stayed directly behind Hart, and I moved when he moved, and I did not look at anything I did not need to look at, and I did not fall behind. Ethan stayed close, not directly beside me, because he needed his hands and attention elsewhere, but always within range, always with an awareness of where I was relative to where he was. At one of the junctions, he reached back without looking and steadied me when the vessel shuddered from an impact to the exterior hull. His hand on my arm for a moment and then gone again. "Almost there," he said. The shuttle was visible at the end of the final corridor, the docking connection still intact, and the last stretch of corridor between us, and it was not empty. A cluster of enemy soldiers had formed up at the midpoint, and Ethan's team had to push through them in a controlled, grinding advance that ate more time than any of us wanted to spend. I fired twice during that advance, which I had not expected to do, and I do not know if either shot accomplished anything useful. But the act of doing something with my hands helped keep the fear from becoming larger than the situation required. Hart was the last one through the shuttle hatch before Ethan, and Ethan came through it at a run and sealed it behind him and said go 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 to the pilot before the seal had fully completed. And the shuttle detached from the enemy hull with a violence that threw me sideways into my seat and would have put me on the floor if the restraint had not caught. Through the viewport, the enemy vessel fell back as we accelerated away from it, alongside it. New dark shapes were arriving from different vectors, converging on the position we had just vacated. They are coming after us, the pilot said. Requesting immediate cover support, Ethan said into his comm. Strike team inbound. Multiple pursuers. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then our cruiser's defense array opened up behind us. Brilliant streaks of return fire that intercepted the closest pursuing vessels and scattered the formation closing in on our tail. The shuttles slipped through the gap and reached the cruiser's docking bay with a jarring, relieved impact that I felt through my entire spine. The hatch opened. I climbed out and stood in the bay and breathed, fully and deliberately. For the first time since we had breached the enemy vessel's hull, Ethan came out directly behind me. He pulled his helmet off and he was flushed and breathing hard, and there was a cut above his left eyebrow that had not been there before. Not deep, but visible. He looked at me for a moment with the particular expression of someone doing a rapid assessment of whether all the important pieces are still present. You did well in there, he said. We make a good team, I said. The words came out naturally, without the weight of everything behind them that they carried. And something in his tired face went a little warmer. We always did, he said. Whitfield met us as we cleared the bay, my father a step behind him. Both of their expressions were the kind that mean the situation has not resolved itself in the time we were gone. But I was holding a data drive that contained what might be the most significant intelligence our combined forces had encountered since the attack on Ashen Reach began. And that changed the shape of what came next. The briefing room that night was not comfortable. It was thorough. Whitfield's analysts began pulling the data from the drive, while the rest of us sat around the table and watched the picture assemble itself piece by piece, each new fragment more sobering than the last. The archive, it turned out, was not a building or a vault in any physical sense. It was a repository. Ancient Dominion knowledge and technology locked away generations ago by ancestors who had decided that some things were too significant to be left accessible to anyone who happened to want them. The locking mechanism was biological. Only a verified heir of the Vaughn bloodline could open it, which made the bloodline itself the key, and the key the obstacle. I looked at my father when this became clear. He was looking at the table. Did you know? I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I knew the broad outline. The full weight of it was to be passed to you on the day of your coronation. That has been the tradition for generations. I never imagined it would come to you this way. I did not say anything to that because there was nothing useful to say. If they eliminate your bloodline before you can formally claim access, Whitfield said, the archive becomes inaccessible to anyone. If they can force the claim to be transferred by other means, through coercion or through finding some gap in the access protocols, they gain everything inside it. Either outcome serves whoever is behind this. Then we need to claim it first, I said. My father looked at me. Ethan, who had been quiet through most of the briefing, leaned forward. If there is a formal claiming process, a ceremony or a protocol, then doing it now, before they can regroup and attempt another strike, is the most defensible option. Waiting gives them time they will use. The ceremony requires a specific location, my father said. There is only one site left that carries the necessary infrastructure, a ceremonial outpost. Several systems from here, ancient. We never moved the infrastructure because moving it was considered more risk than leaving it where it was. Can we reach it safely? Whitfield pulled up a route display. It will require the full fleet as escort, and we should assume they will find out where we are going regardless of what precautions we take. Because whoever is feeding them information has not been identified yet. Then we plan for that, Ethan said. The meeting went for another 2 hours, and by the end of it we had something resembling a plan. Whether it was a good plan was a question none of us could answer with confidence, because good plans assumed a level of known variables that we did not currently possess. But it was a plan and it pointed in a direction, which was more than we had when the day started. After the others filed out, I stayed in the briefing room for a while, sitting in the quiet. The data drive was in Whitfield's analyst's hands now, which was where it belonged. My father had gone to rest under protest. Sella had stationed herself outside the door in the corridor, which I was glad of even if it was unnecessary. I sat and thought about the throne hall ceiling coming apart, and about a woman named Grace who hummed while she worked. and about 15 years that had been spent in parallel by two people who did not know they were both looking for the same thing. Eventually, I went to find Ethan. He was in the small mess hall near the crew quarters, sitting at a narrow table with a cup of something dark and bitter smelling that he pushed toward me without being asked when I sat down across from him. I took it and held it in both hands and let the warmth of it reach my palms. "Hart's shoulder will heal fine," he said. "The medic saw him an hour ago. He is more irritated about the armor damage than the injury itself." "Tell him I am grateful," I said. "All of them. They know." We sat for a while without talking. Outside in the corridor, someone walked past and the sound of it faded and left the silence intact. "That data we found," I said eventually. "The scope of it. Someone has been building that picture for years, possibly longer than I have been alive. How do you fight something that has been planning against you for that long?" He turned the cup in his hands. "Carefully," he said, "and you start from whatever position you are actually in rather than the one you wish you were in." He paused. "You found a way through that locked door today that none of the rest of us could have managed. Whatever this fight becomes, Kaya, you are not facing it without resources." "I do not feel particularly resourceful," I admitted. "I feel like someone who barely got out of her own home and is now trying to make decisions about things that are far larger than she is. For what it is worth," he said, "that describes almost everyone I have ever genuinely respected." I looked at him across the table. This person who had been a boy with scraped knuckles and a too-late laugh, who had spent 15 years making himself into something capable of finding me and then finding me anyway. There was a quality to his tiredness that was different from the exhaustion of a long day. It was the tiredness of someone who had been holding something for a very long time and had only recently been able to set it down. "I am glad you never stopped looking," I said. He met my eyes. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." We sat there in the narrow mess hall with the cruiser humming around us and the stars doing whatever stars do when nobody is paying them attention. And for the first time since the throne hall ceiling had come apart, the thing sitting in my chest was not entirely made of fear. Underneath the fear, and the grief, and the very long list of things I did not yet understand about what was coming, there was something else, something steadier. It felt, in some way I could not fully articulate yet, like resolve. The ceremonial outpost was several systems away, and we would reach it in 2 days. And whatever was waiting for us, there would be waiting for us, regardless of how the next 48 hours went. But sitting here right now, in this moment, on this ship, with this particular person across the table from me, I found that I was not running from anything. That was new. That was worth noticing. I drank the bitter drink and did not say anything more, and neither did he. And outside the viewport, the stars continued their patient, indifferent drift, exactly the way they always had. The 2 days between the briefing room and the ceremonial outpost were not easy ones. They were not supposed to be easy, and I did not expect them to be. But there is a particular quality to waiting when you know what is coming that makes ordinary hours feel dishonest. We ate and slept and went through the motions of existing normally on a ship, moving through open space toward a destination that someone else already knew we were heading to. And the knowledge of that last part sat underneath everything like a stone you keep stepping around. My father spent most of the transit in the small quarters Whitfield had arranged for him, poring over the personnel files we had recovered from the enemy vessel, working through the list of names with a methodical patience that I recognized as the way he handled things he found painful. He did not share what he was finding in those sessions. The tiredness in his face when I checked on him was the kind that comes not from physical injury but from being repeatedly surprised by people you trusted. I did not ask him to tell me. I had enough to carry. Sella ran me through defensive protocols in the corridor outside my cabin each morning for an hour. The same routines she had made me practice since I was a child, which I had resented at 12 and was deeply grateful for now. She did not say much during these sessions. She rarely did. But at the end of the second morning, she stood back and studied me for a moment with the particular evaluating expression she reserved for assessments she intended to be honest. "You are steadier than you were 2 days ago," she said. "I have had practice at being afraid," I said. "There is a difference between being afraid and letting it make your decisions." She paused. "You have always understood that difference better than you gave yourself credit for." It was the most she had said to me about anything other than the drills and days. I held on to it. Ethan and I fell into a rhythm during those 2 days that felt both new and very old at the same time. We had meals together when schedules allowed it. We talked in the evenings, first in the small mess hall and then, on the second night, Back in the observation deck, where we had sat together the first night, the conversations moved through practical things and personal ones without a clear boundary between them. The way conversations do between people who are not performing anything for each other. He told me about his years of service, the assignments he had taken partly for strategic reasons and partly for the access they gave him to information networks. I told him things about the 15 years I had spent as heir that I had not said aloud to anyone. Not because they were secrets, but because there had never been anyone who asked who I actually wanted to answer. He was a good listener. He had always been a good listener, even as a child. Even when listening had not been the fashionable response. He did not interrupt, and he did not redirect, and he did not offer reassurance that was not warranted. Simply paid attention, which turned out to be the thing I had needed most. On the second evening, about an hour before we reached the outpost system, we sat in comfortable quiet on the observation deck bench and watched the stars move. The conversation had wound down naturally to silence. The good kind, the kind that does not require filling. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said eventually, I want you to know that I do not have regrets about any part of how I got here. The years, the assignments, the career complications, none of it. You might have been happier, I said, living an ordinary life, not chasing something that might not have been findable. He considered that seriously, the way he considered things. I do not think that is true, he said. I think I would have spent an ordinary life wondering, and wondering would have been harder than looking. I looked at the stars. I am glad I remembered, I said. I know they took the memories on purpose, and I know there were reasons for it that were probably practical and probably correct. But sitting here now, I am glad the conditioning did not hold completely. I am glad something kept. It kept because it was real, he said simply. I did not have anything to add to that, so I did not add anything. And we sat there until the ship's lighting shifted to signal the approach to the outpost system. And both of us got up and went to prepare for what came next without discussing whether we were ready for it. Because ready was not really a condition that the next several hours was going to wait for. The ceremonial outposts sat on the surface of a small moon, barren and heavily cratered in the way of things that have been patient for a very long time. From approach, it looked like nothing. A low structure built into the side of a ridge, its materials so old they had taken on the color and texture of the surrounding rock, indistinguishable from a distance from a natural formation. Whitfield's forces had spent the past 2 days reinforcing its perimeter defenses as quietly as possible, transforming what had been an abandoned relic into something capable of holding for at least a short time under sustained assault. The tactical officer reported contacts before we had completed the approach sequence. Multiple unidentified vessels, she said, converging from 3 separate vectors. The bridge went quiet for a moment. They knew, my father said from beside me. His voice was entirely flat. Someone told them exactly where we were going. Then we proceed anyway, I said. I surprised myself with how steady my voice came out. Not because I was not afraid. I was, but because the fear was smaller than the certainty that had settled into place underneath it during the past 2 days. Running was not going to solve anything. The archive still needed a guardian. The conspiracy still needed unraveling. And every hour we spent retreating was an hour they spent preparing the next attempt. Ethan looked at me from across the bridge. Something in his expression had the quality of a person seeing something they had been hoping to see confirmed. Are you certain? He said. I spent my entire childhood being told that danger was something to move away from. I said, I am done moving away. Let us finish this. He nodded once. Slowly, then he turned to Whitfield. The fleet engages the incoming vessels in orbit. We take a ground team to the outpost entrance, small and fast. Whitfield did not argue. He was already moving. The descent to the surface was rough. The shuttle buffeted by the opening exchanges of the battle starting in orbit above us. And I held the seat restraints and breathed and focused on the mission outline the way Sella had taught me to focus during training. One thing at a time in the order they came. The ground team was 7 soldiers plus Ethan plus me, which was small enough to move quickly and large enough to hold a position for a limited time if necessary. The lunar surface received us with gray dust and silence, and a view of the battle overhead that was both distant and enormous. Streaks of weapons fire crossing the dark sky in patterns too fast to follow individually. The outpost entrance was 300 meters across open ground, and we moved across it at speed. Enemy transport craft were already descending near the ridge. Ethan tracked them without breaking stride. They are putting soldiers on the ground, Hart said from his position at the team's right flank. Significant numbers. Then we do not slow down, Ethan said. We reached the entrance to the outpost with perhaps 90 seconds to spare before the first wave of enemy ground forces closed to engagement range. The entrance was a low arch cut directly into the rock, dark beyond the threshold, sealed until Ethan's team had the door mechanism running with a compact device that looked improvised and worked immediately. I started forward. Ethan moved in front of me. He positioned himself in the entrance, facing outward, and looked at me over his shoulder. And in that look was everything the situation required, and several things it did not, but that were true anyway. "I will hold this position," he said. "You go inside. Find the chamber and do what needs to be done. We will secure the perimeter. I am not leaving you here," I said, and I meant it with everything I had. The full weight of 2 days of recovering something I had thought was permanently lost. His team was already taking positions around the entrance. Hard at one corner, 2 more soldiers fanning out to cover the approach vectors. Enemy forces were visible now at the edge of the ridge, moving with purpose. "You have to," Ethan said. His voice was completely level. "What happens in that chamber is the whole point of everything we have been doing since Ashen Reach. None of it means anything if you do not reach it." "I know," I said. "I also know that you standing in that doorway against what is coming across that ridge is not a sustainable position." "No," he agreed. "Which means you need to move quickly." There was no time for the argument I wanted to have. He was right, and I knew it, and the knowing of it did not make it easier by a single degree. "Promise me you will follow," I said. He held my eyes for a moment, and in his expression I found something that had been there before, many years ago. A boy making a promise on a broken fence at the edge of a school field with the complete unconscious confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt his own word. "I promise," he said. I turned and I ran. The interior of the outpost swallowed the sound of the battle behind me. The walls were stone and ancient composite material, covered in symbols I recognized from childhood history lessons as belonging to the earliest period of my family's history, before the Dominion had taken its current form, before any of the treaty structures that governed our systems had existed. The symbols were everywhere, floor and ceiling and walls, and they glowed faintly in a way that did not seem to come from any light source I could identify. They seemed to respond to my presence, brightening slightly in the sections I moved through and dimming in the sections I had left behind. The chamber was at the center of the structure, which I found by following these symbols inward and by something else, something less rational than architecture, a pull that I had no better name for than recognition. It was smaller than I expected, a single circular room with a low domed ceiling and walls that seemed to breathe with the same faint light as the corridors. And at its center a pedestal of dark stone that hummed at a frequency just below the range of hearing, something you felt rather than heard. The sounds of the battle at the entrance were muffled here, reduced to distant percussion. My own breathing was loud. I crossed to the pedestal and placed my palm flat against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the chamber filled with light. It was not painful, not sharp. It was more like standing in open sunlight after a very long time indoors. The kind of light that reaches something you did not know had been waiting for it. The ancient systems in the walls and floor came alive in sequence, activating in the order in which they had been built, oldest first. The hum in the pedestal deepened and then changed in quality, shifting from dormant to attentive. The difference between a thing that is waiting and a thing that recognizes what it has been waiting for. The ceremony required words that had been passed down through my family's instruction for longer than any written record I had access to. Words in a language that predated the Dominion by centuries. Words I had been made to learn as a child as a formality, as a piece of historical tradition that everyone had assumed would remain ceremonial in nature. I had not understood then why the memorization was required with such precision. I understood now. I spoke them. My voice was steadier than my hands had been an hour ago. The words carried their own weight, not because of what they meant in translation, but because of what they had always been intended to do, which was make a specific claim in a language that the archive's security recognized and nothing else would satisfy. The light increased. Then it fell away. The chamber went quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet before. Not simply the absence of sound, but the presence of something settled. The pedestal's hum had changed again, from attentive to something I did not have a precise word for. Resolved, perhaps, or completed. The guardianship of the archive had formally transferred to my bloodline's current heir, which was me, and the structure around me had acknowledged it, and whatever came next for any of us. That part was finished. I stood in the quiet for a moment and let the weight of it sit. Then I turned and ran back toward the entrance. The sounds of battle grew louder as I went, pressing back in through the stone walls as I moved away from the chamber and back toward the arch. By the time I reached the entrance, I could hear individual voices and individual weapon discharges, and the specific sounds of people holding a position under sustained pressure. I came through the arch into gray dust and sharp cold air, and the scene outside was different from the one I had left. Not concluded, but changed. The enemy ground forces had been pushed back from the immediate perimeter to a holding distance, and above us the orbital battle had shifted to something that looked, even to my inexperienced eye, like it was resolving in our favor. Reinforcements had arrived, our combined fleet having pushed the attacking vessels back far enough that the ground situation had lost its momentum. Enemy soldiers were pulling back toward their landing craft in a retreat that looked organized but definitive. My eyes found him immediately. He was leaning against the side of the entrance arch, one hand pressed against his right side, his helmet off, and he was breathing harder than he should have been, but he was upright, and he was looking across the surface toward the retreating enemy forces with the specific expression of someone who has just finished something difficult and is taking stock of whether it stayed finished. "Ethan," I said. He looked up at the sound of my name for him. The tiredness in his face was considerable. The grime and the recent damage to the side of his armor were also considerable. But the smile that started when he saw me was neither of those things. It was slow and genuine and slightly surprised, as if some part of him had not fully believed, until this moment, that promising to follow would be enough. "Told you," he said. I covered the distance between us quickly and stopped just in front of him, close enough to see that the hand pressed against his side was dealing with something more than tiredness. The armor there had taken a hit. Hart appeared from around the corner at that point and shook his head at me briefly, the shake meaning less serious than it looks, which was both reassuring and insufficient. "You were supposed to stay out of the worst of it," I said. "I said I would follow." He shifted slightly, adjusting his position against the arch. I did not specify how intact I would be when I caught up. That is a technical reading of the promise. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that was difficult to describe because it was carrying too many things at once. Relief and exhaustion and something older underneath both of them. Something that had been waiting through 15 years of searching to be allowed to simply exist. "Did it work?" he asked. "The ceremony?" "Yes." He let out a slow breath. "Good." He looked up at the sky, where the battle was winding down into its final exchanges. "Then we can call this a successful day." "You are being generous with the definition of successful." "Relatively," he said, "relative to how the day could have gone. A reasonable day." I stood beside him and looked at the same sky he was looking at. The retreating enemy craft were small now, pulling away at distance. The smoke from the orbital exchanges was dispersing slowly in the darkness between us and the closest stars. Around us, the soldiers from Ethan's team were moving across the area with the systematic quiet of people conducting after-action checks, attending to the wounded, securing the perimeter. Hart came back to report the enemy ground forces fully withdrawn and the landing area clear, delivered this information with his usual economy, and then looked at the side of Ethan's armor in a way that had clear implications. "Medics should see that," Hart said. "It is fine, Sergeant. It is manageable," Ethan corrected. Hart looked at me. "The medics should see it," I agreed. Ethan accepted this with the particular quality of acceptance that means someone has decided that arguing is not worth the energy it would require. He pushed off the arch wall and stood properly and then stopped, because standing properly had apparently reminded him that Hart's assessment was accurate. I moved without thinking, stepping beside him and putting my shoulder under his arm, and he let me, which told me more about the extent of the injury than anything he had said. We walked across the gray surface toward the shuttle that was already descending with the medical team aboard, and neither of us spoke. And the quiet between us was the same quality it had been on the observation deck 2 nights ago, full rather than empty, carrying things that did not need to be said right now because there was plenty of time ahead to say them. The stars above Ashen Reach had been orange the morning this all began. The stars above this cold gray moon were simply stars, indifferent and patient and doing what stars always do, which is continuing regardless. My home was still in ruins. The conspiracy behind the attack was still only partially mapped. The list of names on that data drive still needed to be worked through one by one. And whatever my father was discovering in that process was not going to be comfortable discovering. The archive's existence was known now to people on both sides of this conflict. And what that meant for the months ahead was something none of us could fully predict yet. But the ceremony was complete. The guardianship was transferred, and the person beside me, who had once climbed a broken fence on a small blue planet to bring me apples and refused to let anyone push me around without consequence, had kept the promise he made at an entrance arch on a barren moon the same way he had kept every promise I could remember him making, exactly, without deviation, regardless of what it cost him. The medical shuttle touched down 40 meters ahead of us, and its hatch opened, and people came out of it moving quickly. I looked at Ethan. "When this is over," I said, "when the investigation is complete and the court is rebuilt and the archive is properly secured and everything is as stable as it is likely to get for a while, I want to go back." He looked at me. "Back where?" "Earth," I said. "I want to see the fence." Something moved across his face, slow and real and complicated. "It is probably not there anymore," he said. "That school was old even when we were children." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. The medics were close now. "I will take you," he said, "whatever is left of it." "I know you will," I said. And I did know it, as completely as I had known anything in my life, which was not many things but which had always included him. The medics cleared Ethan in the shuttle bay with the brisk, slightly impatient efficiency of people who had seen considerably worse and were not going to make a performance of this particular case. 2 cracked ribs, a deep bruise along the side that had bled internally in a minor way, a cut on his forearm that needed closing properly. He sat on the edge of the treatment table and submitted to the examination with minimal complaint. Which Hart, standing nearby with his own freshly bandaged shoulder, observed was a personal record. I sat across from them both and watched and did not say anything because there was nothing practical to say, and I had learned over the course of a very strange several days that Ethan responded better to being given space during medical procedures than to being fussed over. He met my eyes once while the medic worked on his arm, and the look he gave me was the specific look of someone who is mildly embarrassed about the degree of fuss being made and wants you to know they are aware of how unnecessary it is. I held the look and did not concede the point, because the degree of fuss being made was entirely warranted, and I was not going to pretend otherwise to make him more comfortable. Hart, for his part, watched this exchange with the expression of a person filing information away for future reference. The days that followed the ceremony at the outpost moved differently from the days before it. There was still urgency, still an enormous amount of work to be done, and a conspiracy to be unraveled, and a court to be rebuilt. But the particular edge of immediate physical danger had lifted enough that it was possible to think in longer stretches, to plan past the next few hours, to remember that there was a future beyond the current crisis, and to begin making tentative decisions about what kind of future that should be. My father threw himself into the personnel files from the data drive with a focus that I recognized as the way he processed things that hurt him. He spent hours each day going through the list of names and cross-referencing it with decades of court history. And the picture that assembled itself was not a simple one. The network that had fed information to whoever was behind the attack was not a single traitor or even a small group. It was a series of individuals across different layers of the court structure, some of whom had been active participants, and some of whom had been manipulated without understanding what they were contributing to, and some of whom fell into a complicated category between those two things that did not have a clean name. He came to me one evening with the conclusions he had reached, and I sat across from him in the small briefing room and listened. And the tiredness in his face was the tiredness of someone who has been doing something painful for an extended period, and has reached the other side of it not by having the pain resolved, but simply by having looked at all of it clearly. "I should have seen some of this sooner," he said, with hindsight. "There were patterns I did not recognize for what they were." "You trusted the people around you," I said. "That is not a failure of judgment. It is what trust is. It needs to be more carefully placed going forward." "I know, and we will be more careful. But being more careful and being right the first time are not the same thing. And I am not willing to have you carry the weight of every piece of this that you could not have known." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have changed since this began." "I have had reason to," I said. He nodded slowly, with the expression of someone accepting something they are not entirely at peace with but have decided to stop fighting. "Yes," he said, "I suppose you have." Whitfield's forces remained engaged through those early weeks, not simply as a military presence but as something closer to a working partnership, which was different from anything the formal treaty documents between our peoples had ever anticipated. Commander Whitfield himself became a fixture at the rebuilding council meetings that my father convened as soon as he was well enough to convene them. His contributions direct and practically oriented in a way that cut through the slower formal processes of Dominion deliberation and got to the useful parts faster. He did not do this with any obvious political calculation. He simply had a way of identifying the thing that mattered in a complicated discussion and saying it plainly, which turned out to be something our council sessions had been missing for longer than the current crisis. Captain Fields took personal charge of the new defense assessments for the outer territories, working with Dominion military architects to identify the gaps that had made the attack on Ashen Reach possible. She had a particular gift for finding the places where existing systems assumed conditions that no longer existed. Places where the defense architecture had been designed around a threat landscape that had since changed, and nobody had updated the underlying assumptions. She did this work with the same clipped efficiency she had shown in every other context I had seen her in, and she occasionally said things in planning sessions that made the senior Dominion defense advisors go quiet, in the way people go quiet when they have heard something they did not want to hear but cannot argue with. Hart visited the council occasionally when Ethan brought him, which was not a frequent occurrence, but enough that I got to know him in a different context than active combat. He was the same person in both contexts, which I found reassuring, dry in his humor, precise in his assessments, and possessed of a quality that I eventually identified as the ability to say a difficult thing in a way that made the room feel lighter rather than heavier, not by minimizing the thing but by acknowledging it with a kind of calm that suggested it was manageable. His shoulder healed cleanly, and he complained about the physical rehabilitation exercises his medic prescribed with a consistency and creativity that suggested the complaint was itself a kind of entertainment. Sella, true to the prediction she had made about herself in the aftermath of the outpost battle, began studying the tactical doctrine of Earth's expeditionary force alongside her regular duties. She did this quietly and without announcing it, acquiring documents through Whitfield's office and working through them in the evenings and arriving at subsequent joint planning sessions with questions that were precise enough that Earth officers involved began to regard her with the specific respect that military people extend to other military people who are clearly doing serious work. She said nothing to me directly about any of this. But one morning about 3 weeks in, she looked at me before a council session and said, "Their ground engagement principles are more adaptable than ours. We should consider whether some of the underlying philosophy has applications in Dominion training contexts." I told her I thought that was worth pursuing. She nodded once, and that was the end of the conversation, and also the beginning of a formal training exchange program that ended up taking months to design and implement properly. The investigation into the archive proceeded in parallel with all of this. What the archive contained, in its full scope, was something that took a long time to understand even partially. Not because the information was obscured, but because the volume of it was enormous, and the context required to interpret much of it was itself something that had to be reconstructed piece by piece. Ancient Dominion records, technological specifications for systems that had been deliberately taken out of use rather than lost to time. Historical accounts of decisions made generations ago by people who had believed that some things were too consequential to leave accessible and too important to destroy. My family had not simply been governing a territory for the past several centuries. We had been keeping a library, and someone had decided that the library was valuable enough to justify the elimination of every person in the family line standing between them and its contents. Who that someone ultimately was became clearer as the weeks of investigation accumulated. I will not rehearse all of it here. What matters is that the network reached into more places than any of us had expected when we started pulling at the threads. And some of what it reached into was uncomfortable enough that the process of addressing it created tensions that took patient, careful work to navigate. My father navigated them with a thoroughness that I watched with something close to admiration, not because it was perfect, but because he did not flinch from any of it. Not even the parts that involved people he had known for decades and trusted without reservation. He aged during that period, visibly, in the way that certain kinds of sustained effort ages people. But the rigidity that had always been part of his bearing, the quality that had made our relationship formal even in private moments, loosened slightly as the weeks passed. He began leaving the door open when he worked. He started asking for my opinion in planning sessions, not perfunctorily but genuinely, waiting for the answer. Once, in a long evening session reviewing the archive materials, he looked up from the files and said, "I used to think protecting you from all of this was the right decision. I am no longer certain that was ever true." I told him that I thought his intentions had always been good, and that good intentions and correct decisions were two different things, and that I had learned that distinction myself very recently under circumstances that had provided excellent instruction. He almost smiled at that. It was the closest thing to a shared joke we had ever had. Ethan recovered steadily. He was back on full duty inside 2 weeks, which was faster than his medic had recommended, and exactly the pace his medic had predicted, regardless of the recommendation. He and Hart returned to their regular assignments within the Joint Operations Framework, which meant they were present in our space for the foreseeable future, attached to Whitfield's command structure for the duration of the stabilization period. This was a practical arrangement that also happened to suit the less practical reality of the situation, which was that the idea of Ethan leaving the general vicinity was something I had not spent time imagining and did not intend to start. We continued our evening conversations on the observation deck when the schedule allowed it, and in various other small spaces when it did not. Sometimes we talked about serious things: the investigation, the archive, the political work of rebuilding alliances that had been strained by the attack and its aftermath, the quiet diplomatic corrections required when other Dominions who had been watching the situation decided they needed reassurance about the Vaughn family's continued stability. Sometimes we talked about less serious things, which was its own kind of recovery. He told me stories about assignments in his years of service that were funny in retrospect, even if they had not been funny at the time. I told him things about court life that were absurd enough to be entertaining if you were not the person who had lived through them. We learned each other again. The long, slow relearning of two people who had known each other at the beginning and were now comparing that version to what the years had made. One evening, about a month after the outpost, I found him on the observation deck before I had planned to come there, which meant he had come without me. He was standing rather than sitting, arms crossed, looking out at the star field with the particular posture of someone whose thoughts have gotten ahead of them, and they are trying to catch up. I sat on the bench and waited. He turned after a moment, not surprised to see me. He had stopped being surprised by things I did that he had come to expect, which seemed like a reasonable benchmark for how far we had come from the medical bay on the night of the attack. He sat beside me. The viewport outside showed a star field we had moved through enough times now that I was starting to recognize particular configurations, which felt like a small but real form of belonging somewhere. "I have been thinking about after," he said. "After as in, after the investigation is complete. After the stabilization period ends and the Joint Operations Framework winds down and Whitfield's command gets its next assignment." I looked at him. He looked back, and in his expression was the particular quality of someone who has thought carefully about what they are about to say and has decided to say it anyway. "I want to stay," he said, "not as an assignment. I want to formally request a transfer to the liaison office your father and Whitfield have been building. It is a real posting with real work attached to it, and it is also, I am aware, a convenient structure for something that is less formally defined. The politics of it will be complicated," I said. "Yes. People will have opinions about it. People always have opinions," he said. "I have spent 15 years caring more about finding you than about what people thought of the process. I am not particularly inclined to change that policy now that the finding is done." I looked at him for a long moment in the low light of the observation deck. Outside, the stars did what they always did. "The politics will be complicated," I said again. "And there will be moments when the two worlds we are trying to build something between will pull in directions that are difficult to reconcile. There will be long stretches where the practical work is unglamorous and frustrating, and when the progress feels slower than the problems." He nodded. He was not surprised by any of this. He had thought about all of it, especially those parts. He said quietly, "Whatever comes next. I want to be here for the whole of it, not just the moments that resolve well." I believed him. That was the thing about Ethan Grant that I had known when I was a child and had confirmed in the past weeks in context after context. He said what he meant and he meant what he said. Not because he was incapable of more complicated maneuvering, but because he had simply decided at some point that he was not going to spend his energy on it. The boy who had stood between me and trouble on a school field without asking whether I was worth the trouble had grown into a man who operated exactly the same way. He had decided what mattered and he pointed himself toward it and he did not deviate. I have not had someone stay beside me simply because they chose to, I said, not without ceremony or obligation or political context providing the framework. I am not entirely certain I know how to have that. You know how to have it, he said. You have known since you were 8 years old, sitting under an apple tree on a small blue planet. You just had it taken from you and spent a long time without the practice. That is probably true. I will remind you if you forget. I looked at him. You are very confident for someone who has cracked ribs that are not fully healed. He smiled then. The full version. The one that came half a second later than other people's, because he had always needed to confirm for himself that the thing was genuinely worth smiling at. It had been one of the things I remembered most clearly from childhood, the particular timing of that smile. And seeing it now was the same as it had always been, which was that it made whatever room it was in feel different. I will note, he said, that the ribs are essentially healed. Essentially is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. He conceded this with a slight inclination of his head. We sat for a while longer in the comfortable way we had found, and I thought about everything that had happened in the weeks since the throne hall ceiling had come apart, and what had been lost in that time and what had been found, and what was still unfinished, and what was being built. The list of unfinished things was still long. The list of things being built was also, slowly, becoming substantial. My home was in ruins, or it had been. But the reconstruction of Ashen Reach had begun, coordinated between Dominion engineers and an Earth architectural team that Fields had quietly identified and attached to the project because she had correctly anticipated that nobody was going to object. The reconstruction was going to take years and the result was going to look different from what had stood there before, not identical to what was lost, but something, a thing made from what remained and what was added to it, which was perhaps an honest enough metaphor for most of what was happening. The archive's guardianship was mine. I did not fully understand what that meant yet, not in the practical day-to-day sense. The archive was not a single document you read through and then understood. It was a repository of things accumulated over generations by people who had believed they were preserving something important enough to protect at significant cost. Some of what it contained was immediately useful, and some of it required context I did not yet have, and some of it was simply history. The kind that matters not because it changes what you do next, but because knowing where you came from changes how you understand where you are. There had been a morning, about 2 weeks after the outpost, when I had gone alone to the room that Whitfield's archivists had set up for the work of processing the archive's accessible materials. And I had sat for 2 hours reading the account of the first member of my family who had accepted the guardianship. She had written in a language that was only partially intelligible to me in its original form. And what I was reading was a partial translation that the archivists had assembled from cross-references and context. But the character of the person on the page was clear enough. She had not wanted the responsibility. She had accepted it because there was no one else and because the alternative was allowing something significant to simply end. And she had described this decision without drama, with the same plainness that decisions made under pressure and without good alternatives tend to have when you write them down honestly afterward. I had found that comforting in a way I had not expected to find anything comforting in that room, what I eventually told the Inter-Dominion representatives. When the first round of formal meetings was arranged and I stood in front of people who were assessing whether our house was going to survive what had happened to it, was not what I had been trained to say in diplomatic contexts. What I had been trained to say was careful and calibrated and correct in all its formal particulars. What I said instead was something closer to what was actually true, which was that we had come through something difficult, and we were not finished coming through it, and we understood now things about the fragility of our situation that we had not understood before, and that understanding was going to change how we operated. I said this without excessive formality and without the particular kind of careful understatement that Dominion diplomatic tradition favored. And some of the representatives looked slightly uncertain about this departure from the expected register. Ethan, standing in his liaison role against the side wall of the chamber, looked exactly as he had when he had watched me try to shoot a weapon for the first time in a corridor on an enemy vessel, like something was going the way he had hoped it might. After the meeting, Sella fell into step beside me in the corridor and said, "That was a different approach than your father tends to take with the outer Dominion representatives." "I know, it was effective." "Was it?" "They believed you," she said. "People can tell the difference between someone reading a position and someone saying what they actually think." She was quiet for a moment. Your father has always been a skillful reader of positions. That is its own kind of effective. But what you did in there was something else. She did not say it as a criticism of my father, and I did not take it as one. Different people have different instruments, and the measure of good judgment is knowing which one the situation requires. I was still learning that. I suspected I would be learning it for a long time. That evening, I found Ethan in the small garden area that the cruiser's designers had included in the officers' quarters section. A narrow room with actual growing things in it that served no tactical purpose whatsoever and made the rest of the ship feel less institutional by its existence. He was sitting on a low bench near the window that looked out over the garden, reading something on a small device. And he looked up when I came in with the easy attentiveness that had become one of the things I associated most with him. The way he was never anything other than fully present in whatever room he was in. I sat beside him. "How did the afternoon session go?" he asked. "Whitfield and my father reached an agreement on the permanent liaison framework," I said. "It is going to require some creative structuring to be acceptable to both governments. But the fundamentals are agreed on, and the position you mentioned to me last week, also agreed on," I said. "The details are being handled by Whitfield's office and our diplomatic team, and it will take another few weeks to formalize. But yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. I looked at him. "Are you going to be more expressive about this than that?" "Possibly," he said. "Later, when the formal processes have run their course and the position is actually confirmed, and I am not at risk of cursing the thing by reacting to it prematurely." "That is a very measured response." "I am a very measured person," he said, and the smile arrived on its half-second delay, and I felt it the same way I always felt it, which was that it made the day feel like a different kind of day than the one it had been a moment before. Outside the garden window, the stars continued. They had been continuing this whole time. Through the attack and the escape and the tunnel and the reunion in the medical bay and the observation deck and the boarding operation and the outpost and everything that had followed. They were going to continue through whatever came next. Conspiracies and archive guardianships and formal diplomatic agreements and the slow reconstruction of a home and the longer, slower reconstruction of a life that had been interrupted at 8 years old and was now being resumed, with amendments, under entirely different conditions. I was not the same person who had stood in the throne hall when the ceiling came apart. I was not the girl who had been sent to Earth with a simple name and told to be ordinary, and then brought back and told to forget she had ever been there. I was not entirely certain yet what I was instead, but I had a reasonable sense of its outlines. A person who had looked at a very large and complicated situation and chosen to walk toward it rather than away, and had found that walking toward it, while not comfortable, was more honest than the alternative. Ethan had once said that he had spent 15 years refusing to accept that I was simply gone. That seemed, in retrospect, like an accurate description of something that had also been true of me, operating in the opposite direction. I had not consciously remembered him, not after the physicians had done their careful work, but something had kept anyway, too heavy to go all the way under regardless of what was done to it. The fence, the apples, the particular timing of a laugh that arrived late because the person laughing was always checking first. Some things are just too real to stay buried, and that, I thought, sitting in the garden room with the stars moving outside and Ethan beside me and the whole uncertain, complicated future waiting patiently past the next series of planning sessions, was perhaps the most honest thing I had learned from all of it. I was not running anymore. I was not hiding under a simple name in a simple life on a small quiet planet while other people made decisions about the shape of things. I was not waiting in a ceremonial role for my turn to inherit a responsibility I did not understand. I was standing in the place I had chosen to stand, beside the person I had chosen to stand beside, with a clear enough view of what was ahead that I could make useful decisions about how to meet it. The stars outside the garden window moved their slow, patient arc. The ship hummed its familiar low note. Somewhere down the corridor, Hart was probably complaining about something to someone who had made the mistake of asking how he was doing, and Sella was probably going through tactical documents with the focused thoroughness she brought to everything she decided was worth her attention. And my father was probably still in his quarters, with the files and the long process of understanding what his court had been and what he intended it to become. And here, in this small garden room on a military cruiser somewhere in the outer rim, two people who had once stolen apples from an old woman's tree on a small, blue planet and promised each other things on a broken were sitting close enough that the silence between them was comfortable, and the future. which was going to be difficult and significant and full of work that neither of them could fully anticipate yet. Felt less like something approaching and more like something being built. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. I leaned my head back against the wall and looked at the stars and did not say anything at all, and neither did he. And the quiet between us was the best kind of quiet there is. The kind that has nothing missing from it,